Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton, one of the leading lights of this part of the world. Welcome, Buck.
Well, I feel like a 40-watt bulb sometimes, but we do what we can.
It's good. So. No, it's good to see you here, and we have these often efforts at erudite discussions. I don't know if we quite make it all the time. Well, tonight I'm going to just take the football and run with it a little bit.
Yeah, I hear you had an interesting,
I brought a little,
interesting episode
I
when
brought
you
a little
recently
souvenir
returned.
back, and it's a springboard for nation states, how the government enforces boundaries, etc. So, as you may know, I spent an interesting week recently in the United Kingdom. And I spent a little time at Oxford, which was pretty interesting experience, and then in London, and then in the Cotswolds, just jumping around a little bit. And one of the things I did was I went into a very famous bookstore, which maybe I won't mention, but it's right on the main drag in London, and I bought a number of books. And then the books were sent back to me, and they came quite expeditiously. And then when the package bearing the books arrived, maybe you could see it here. In any event, the government had opened the books to presumably see what's there, and we can say it's been examined by the U.S. Let's see, the U.S. I guess what do we? I can't quite read it. The U.S. Customs Service and
yes.
the Border Protection Agency. So presumably this is the way that any bombs that are coming in or huge stacks of cocaine appear, and all kinds of sinister motives might be out there. And I was rather surprised this had happened. I said to my wife, maybe I'm on some kind of watch list.
Well,
and she said to me, it's probably your association with that bad Buck Melton.
Probably so.
There's been some collateral damage.
No-fly list. And then they open it up and find books, and they think, well, there's nothing to that. But then that always puts me in the mind, when I go to the post office to mail something, and they ask, is there anything dangerous in it? And it's a book. I want to say, yes, there's something very dangerous. And I mean it, but I don't mean it in the way that they mean it. But I'm always put in the mind, and I can't remember whether it's Mao or Lenin, who once wrote that ideas are more dangerous than bullets.
That's true, so I think.
You've got something very dangerous.
That's true. And I mean, I have one example of the book here. It's called The Eagle and the Lion, and it's about the Roman Empire in the 4th century being the eagle and the lion being the Persian Empire. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, maybe someone mistook this for the eagle being the USA, and then maybe the lion possibly being, I'm sure people don't know what symbol the lion is these days. It could be any bad place, but maybe it's some relationship with Iran and blowing buildings up. Well, so in any event, I can't object to the government looking after its borders a little bit. I mean, if this is a way to stop cocaine coming into the country or bombs or some plague or some horrible thing happening, it did seem pretty unusual to me, and then I will now segue into our porous borders in general and what the government is doing. They apparently seized on my purchase of these books as a potential, bullet coming toward the country's heart. Be that as it may, what really seems to be happening is, can the nation secure its borders? It does seem a little bit not the best use of effort, I think, but with thousands of people pouring across the southwestern border, bringing all kinds of whatever into the country, a lot of drugs, obviously, and it would be very easy for terrorist agents to come in. As a matter of fact, I think I could say that one of the things happening in Cuba now, which is a communist country close to us, is the Cubans are, many of them for great reasons, going to Nicaragua. The planes fly out of Havana, you can do that, and they're just making their way up to Texas and crossing the border pretty easily, and then finding their way into the country. And indeed, foreign intelligence agents of any type could come in evil worshipers or evil people could come into the country at random, easily. Millions of people are pouring in. The border has been wide open for a number of years. The government has no inclination to do anything about it, except when Joe Sam Robinson returns with a big basket of books here. They seize upon this and open it up to check. And I just wonder, did someone mistake the book there for some kind of a terrorist manual? But I'll let it go at that. And I will now ask you some questions, maybe about the right of the U.S. to police its borders. Is there a guarantee anywhere that people have free access to the United States in law, in the Constitution? Can the U.S. legitimately close its borders at will to different people or altogether? Can it close them? Does it have an obligation to keep its borders open?
Well, no, it's actually sort of one of the fundamental definitions of statehood, of international law, that you have sovereignty over your territory. Now, there may be some sort of international convention or something by virtue of being in the UN that I'm not aware of, but no, an attribute of sovereignty is the ability to police your borders. It doesn't even need to be written down. It's what Alexander Hamilton might refer to as an inherent power in the Constitution.
Well, I mean, presumably, maybe we can explore this a little bit. The U.S. had open borders, I believe, for a long period of time, even before passports were there.
Yes.
So if you showed up from whatever country or wherever you came from, and you just, the sailing ship docked in a port, and off you went, etc., to jump around. And we can also say that bonded people, you could say slaves, did not require a passport, or anyone could come in. I mean, it's obviously a terrible situation, but any person could just walk in or be chained and come in chains, and no one made any efforts to stop that from happening on the basis of the government controlling its borders.
Yes, prior to the early 1920s, the only real big exception to that leaps out of me, of course, were the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. And there were 2 or 3 immigration laws regarding that simply made it, first of all, harder to legally come into the country and easier to deport aliens in time of war. But yeah, passports are really very much a modern, as we understand them, are a modern innovation. And they largely came about in the Western world because of World War I. But coming out of World War I, you had much more stringent border control, the introduction of passports for entering into a country as opposed to getting out of a country. And at the same time, you had the burst of nativism that also helped produce the rise of the new KKK that had emerged shortly before. And it's at that point we get the really restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s that in many ways didn't get relaxed until the 1960s.
So a lot of the immigration that took place into the country, and it's a big country, over 3 million square miles. The population density is small. People had a lot of boosterism. We want our town to be bigger. We want more people. How can we get more people here? And we'd love to have some immigrants, although apparently, and I'll ask this question, immigrants from the Orient were excluded or kept out, or there's a lot of, I think particularly the Japanese or anyone. I mean, do you have any comments about that?
Yes, that caused a lot of tension between the United States and Japan, and that was interesting because for a while we were fine with Chinese immigration, largely to build up a labor force on the West Coast, to build the Transcontinental Railroad, although they were discriminated against and there ultimately were limitations put on them. In Japan, and I'd have to do some research to figure out why that was the case, but we started putting in some severe restrictions on Japanese immigration around the turn of the 20th century, which really led to major friction and was only resolved by the so-called gentleman's agreement that we sort of nationally backed off on that. A lot of the impetus, I think, had come from local and state governments. San Francisco in particular did not like the Japanese coming in and tried to do what it could to exclude, and the federal government had to finally jump in and say, no, we'll permit more of this. But then, of course, that tied into the whole U.S.-Japanese tension that continued to build until Pearl Harbor, and then, of course, we got the internment cases. So.
Yes. Well, I mean, so nationhood, what does that mean? What's a nation state? What exactly is that? And so the U.S. is certainly and that's a big, I guess, vexing mission, problem, possibility that the nation has, 350 million people of all kinds of ethnic arrangements and different viewpoints, political, social connections. Everyone's here, and everyone is trying to get along, I would say, with some difficulty.
Well, I'd say most people are trying to get along.
Oh, that's true.
Perhaps, maybe I'm even being too charitable with that phrase, most people. I'd say a sizable majority are sort of a live and let live.
We'd like for that to be the case, but just to go back to this point, should the government do more about limiting, immigration into the country? I believe there's not much discussion about this, and the government if it has some rules there, I mean, that would seem to fulfill the mission of a state. So we have some rules about coming in. Okay, or the people think the rules are too generous or not generous enough, but there's some rules, and I think there's family. One of the big things is an anchor immigrant can presumably, if he or she becomes a citizen, bring in the whole family, the whole village can come in, just one after the other with this connection. The other point is there's a large immigration quotas, if one wishes to use that word, of over 1 million people. So there are lots and lots of ways to get into the country. I think visas are another way. So there are visas, I think, the H-1B visas for quite talented people. So you could say, well, you can just come here because you're a very clever scientist. We have some rules. You could come in. And presumably, the government would enforce those entry rules. However, it appears that you can also come in here very, very, very easily just to walk across the border or overstay your visa. And so the number of people that are, you could use the word illegal immigrants here, which in some ways represents the failure of the state to police its, if you want to use that phrase, police its borders, and is a fundamental problem with our nationhood. You could say that. I mean, is that wrong to say that?
Well, I think we have to start by defining what we understand the word nation to be. And there are many different ways to define that. There's ethnic nationhood. So for instance, if you look at currently Israel right now, it's defined partly by their territory, but more so by the fact that you are Jewish. I mean, that's an inherent part of Israeli nationhood. I mean, going back to biblical language, the nation of Israel. Other places,
you could say it was a nation state then. That meets your, however, about 20% of the people there are Islamic. I mean, to say that in the country.
But if you look at the tensions there between Judaism and Islam, that many people in Israel say, if you're Muslim, you don't belong here. God gave it to us. We were here first. So, and you have to distinguish between nation and state, and that's what we're trying to do here, because nation is not really an international law term. It's more a notion of tribal identity. And then the question simply becomes, how is the tribe defined? It can be defined by blood. It can be defined by territory. It can be defined by shared values. whereas state is a much more legal concept. So you can have city-states, you can have nation-states. So what is it that makes the United States a nation-state? It's certainly not ethnicity. It's partly territory, but I would argue that the main thing is the United States civil religion of republicanism. And by that I mean public participation in government, the concept of the rule of law, that it applies or should apply equally to everyone, that the basic notion of basic human rights, the notion of tolerance, of no established religion, of live and let live. Now, have we always lived up to these things? Of course not. Is that the ideal that we shoot for? Yes, traditionally that has always been the case. And so the next question is, does the modern wave of immigration we are facing, since we are all immigrants here, is the modern wave of immigration, including illegal immigration, somehow qualitatively different from what we have traditionally had, and does that threaten our nationhood?
Well, just to use your phrase, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll make a few comments about it. Number one is that it would be very, very difficult for a nation, depending on the definition of a nation, to say the U.S. is a nation. And one has to work at the definition to do that, although I would say there have been many times in our history when they could say, well, all right, it looks like they're doing this with a sense of nationhood. There was pretty restricted entrance into the country. So you could say, well, I'm so happy to be here. That's great. And you could compare the country with other places, and people felt a great deal of pride in that. Additionally, the U.S. was standing up, and it's a difficult path to moral views or values. They tried to. I think the country tried to do that. They certainly fought the Hun, to talk about World War I, or they were certainly beat the Axis powers. And then they could say, well, they overcame what might be called communism, and there might be another word for it now. I won't, that's another subject. But in any event, they did these great values. There was a great sense of solidarity, and on and on. And then I think as the external enemies went away a little bit, the notion of nationhood became more difficult. And indeed, people, if one says the moral glue of a nation would be we've acted a moral way and we all tried to do pretty well. Instead, the idea is to split the population up into different groups and to say one group injured another, and therefore that group needs to be punished. And certainly, or something taken away from them or diminished. And the traditional heroes of the country, because of their ethnicity, been cast down, their statues pulled down, kind of rather like King George III, or like the Taliban doing something. The same thing happens here. And you could say, well, those people do not comport with my values, how I define the nation, and I'm going to destroy them. And then when that happens, how one plots this difficult path is uncertain. And I think the situation is made worse if you have a tremendous porous border and millions of people without an historic connection to this geographical area pour into the country for their good reasons on their part. The major one, I think, would be economic. So if you can come here, the standard of living is whatever it is, and in general, security there are other advantages. There's security, but I think in my opinion, the primary reason to be here is economic welfare, and also the substantial social benefits the government bestows on anyone that here. They would not be present elsewhere. And moreover, once one gets on their feet, the barriers to obtaining great wealth are, I would submit, less here than in other countries where there's a more rigid hierarchy. I think here, immigrants have a big chance of doing well, and so those are reasons that attract people. But sort of my comment is, what is the best thing from a narrow point of view for the 350 million people here? I mean, should the government, it's great they checked on my books here, but
well, you gave them permission to do that.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, implied consent by coming, as an American citizen coming back into the country by taking ship and coming in here, you impliedly consented. You gave your consent to having your stuff searched.
Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah.
So you could just be searched. What about stripped, body stripped, or whatever else they do? Your internal cavities checked, and on and on. I mean, is that, will I imply that consent?
Well, as a matter of fact, when you go through the checkpoint at Atlanta Airport to get onto the plane, yes, you're consenting to that. If you give them any trouble and they really have reasonable suspicion that something's going on, they can take you into a little room and get kind of personal with you.
Well, I mean, that's a rather...
And if you don't want to do that, then just don't fly.
I hope you mentioned implied consent with a tongue against your cheek here. It is a slippery slope. Implied consent...
I'm telling you what the law would say. I don't necessarily approve of it.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it?
Yes.
So the government has, whatever it is, implied consent to whatever it is, put you in prison for a month to check and see if you have any kind of disease.
Well, at some point,
we're going to put you in there.
At some point, the judges that you don't really like would step in and say, "Well, that's not reasonable."
Now, Bucky,
the most important word in the legal language, and of course, reason is in the eye of the beholder.
But Bucky, I'm trying to straighten the judges out and make useful suggestions.
Because they need to be straightened out because they're up to no good.
Any powerful agency needs some attention. I mean, rightly or wrongly. Yes. I mean, you don't want to let the lions prowl the forest too unobserved.
Yes. But to get back to it, and I want to back up several minutes here. I mean, I would agree with you. I think that any nation, any notional nation, how is that for alliteration? Is at least partly artificial. I mean, the fact that we grow up, and I'm sure you recited the Pledge of Allegiance when you were at Lanier,
of course,
right? And,
yes.
And this is reinforcing the notion that you're part of something bigger than yourself, and
in Vietnam, I did my service, such as it was.
Yes,
I mean, okay, I'm an American. The country needs me, and so I'll go in the Georgia National Guard.
Yeah, there's always some artifice, and I would say that if you're an insular country, you need less artifice. I mean, the fact of your nationhood is a little bit more obvious. But then you look at the British Isles, and you look at what, first of all, Brexit, and then within the British Isles, look at the Scottish movement to get out, or here, look at Quebec's arguments. In our own history, look at Southern secession. But regardless of that, there is something. And yes, economic opportunity is part of it, but freedom of conscience is also has traditionally been part of it. But yes, when we came over, when our people, when Europeans came over, and when Africans were brought over, when Africans were kidnapped and forcibly brought over, the thing common to all of them is that we were cut off in most, if not all, practical ways from the place and the people that we came from. And we had to found and forge something new here. And it was an amalgam. I mean, you had Highland Scots, you had, by the 1840s, you had the Celts coming in. To a degree, it was. We did found something that everybody more or less bought into. Not everybody, of course, but I'm talking in general terms. Now, if you compare that to modern immigration, the numbers are far greater, I think, both in a relative sense and an absolute sense. And I want to stop here before I take one more step. I am not knocking the individual immigrants. I have said on this program many times that the illegal immigrant from Mexico or up from Central America in many ways is more American than we are, because he's doing what our forebears did. He's leaving everything behind. He's coming here. He's working 24/7 and doing the scut jobs that you and I and our families don't want to do for really low wages. But as a group, as a demographic, they are not leaving behind 3,000 miles away across an ocean their old culture and assimilating. They are staying very closely connected to that culture. It's only a few hundred miles away. They're connected to it by cell phones and by bank accounts. And this is going, for better or worse, to work a very fundamental demographic shift in what we are calling the American nation, and it will also change American values and how we have defined ourselves.
Well, you really around the bases pretty quickly there, and good for you. I mean, you made some important points. So one point is the demographic changes in the Earth. The Homo sapien population is just dramatically changing. And if you thought the world needs to be a democracy, then the group of people that had the greatest number would presumably run the place, and that would probably be the Chinese and the people in the Indian subcontinent together. That's about half the world. Also, the population that's taking place, the population shifts are extraordinary. And so people of European descent, particularly Western European descent, for many reasons, are not really reproducing. And it's another whole other subject. But so their percentage of the world's population is diminishing, and they still control an enormous amount of the world's wealth, prosperity. So wherever you are, if you're of European descent, you know, many things can happen, but your situation is going to be better for that billion people or so than the other 7 billion people that are out there. And those people would like to, which would be reasonable. A rational person would do that. I'm in this terrible situation in my native country, and if I can get to the States, everything is great. And the States have arranged, for better or worse, and one could ask this question, from whence came the incredible, unusual situation that exists in the country, that the doors are open everywhere for people to come in from anywhere, however they want to, and legally getting in the country. There are many, many, many ways to get in the country that other nations don't have. And besides this, these porous borders that I think, if the I think probing the reason the borders are porous is that it can be said that the U.S. is a nice moral place, and they regret the fact that in the past they excluded anyone. I think particularly Jewish people fleeing from the Nazis. If they didn't get here, they were going to the gas chamber, and so at least to some degree the doors were closed, and out of guilt in some ways the doors are wide open now for anyone that can claim anything. I mean, why are you here? Well, I'm threatened by a gang. Okay, what gang is that? Well, they're called the Bad Boys, and they're in Guatemala City. Okay, we'll talk about it in court, and you come, you're on your own, you're jumping around, and recently, all kinds of things happen once you're across the border. In California, you can get a driver's license, and presumably, if you're of Venezuelan descent in New York City, they're going to give you work permits, and in some parts of the country, you can vote without being a citizen or having any particular relationship with the country. So it would appear that one of the substantial, I would submit this, one of the substantial things that's injuring the sense of nationhood is the present immigration policy. Now, of course, as you well pointed out, these immigrants do all kinds of other good things. Many of them are wonderful people that maybe the country needs increased population. And maybe their moral values, after all their suffering, can be on a high level. I mean, all those things are possible. But certainly, right now, there is no political will, as far as I can see, to close the border. The Democrats, I'll say, maybe this is not the correct opinion, but I would say they have a political interest in having lots of immigrants without property that are going to depend on the largesse of the government to some degree, and thus their Democratic politicians will get secure positions, and in those secure political positions, they can many good things, including wealth, can come their way. On the other side, the Republicans, many, not everybody, but many people need the labor, a cheaper type of labor that's very motivated and does a great job and does work no one else would do. We've got to have these immigrants here to pick peaches, shall I say, and so they don't want any reform, and thus this is kind of what happens. And the situation has gone so far that we just have to accept, it appears, that's the way it is, and that we will not have any effective mechanism to change these immigration patterns with billions of people that would like to be in the country, and that's what we're faced with. So a whole change in language, ethos, cultural identity, interpretation of past history, the ability to be on the same page in difficult times.
Well, I know we're running short of time, but I would love to continue this for another half hour, because I think a lot of this is determined by geography and both our approach and our background, as well as our understanding of the basic notion of what today might be called human rights. And I think at one level, these things have determined a lot of our policy. And then on the other level, I think you're right, and I'm glad to see that you're quoting me about what the Democrats and Republicans want from a very selfish viewpoint to try to boost their poll numbers or their pocketbooks. I think you're absolutely right about that.
Well, if I accidentally quoted you, I give both of us credit for that. Number one, for you to have said it, and number two, for me of taking it to heart. Well, on that note, thank you, Buck. It's great to see you. We had a very interesting conversation.
And I'm glad you made it back in with your,
I hope
your dangerous
our
ideas
audience says how outraged I was when I saw my books had been opened by the feds. Yes. I was quite outraged.
Thank God you gave your implied consent.
Enough to come here to bring it up. Okay.
Yes.
Well, okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.